Any great series isn't just about the main characters. Yes, all pieces of fiction focus mostly on what their featured subjects are doing, but it's the dynamic shared by its side characters that truly proves the worth of a verse's lore building. And by that metric, Skull Knight's rivalry with Nosferatu Zodd has to be one of the greatest economic storytelling successes in manga history. The pair has only faced each other twice over the course of Berserk's enormous run, and neither time do we get to see their battle at length, but it's the mythology of both characters and the eternal nature of their dynamic that makes their matchup one of the defining rivalries of the series. And to top it all off, we are yet to discover the answer to the ultimate destination of the journey any rivalry goes on. Who will win in the end? Who will stand tall, bathed in the blood of their enemy, and who will make or break the hidden machinations of causality? We'll answer all that and more in this video. An enmity forged in undeath, the basis for Skull Knight and Zodd's rivalry. For a rivalry that's considered to be unending by both of its participants, it's only fitting that they themselves are also immortal. Both Skull Knight and Zodd are undead creatures at the time of their introduction. In fact, when Skull Knight first appears in the series, God mistakes him for Zodd because their presence is quite similar, and so is the bloodlust radiating off their being. Both Zodd and Skull Knight are fierce and fearsome warriors foremost, and that's not where the parallels between them end. In their first encounter with each other, Guts is warned by Nosferatu Zodd of a terrible, inescapable fate that awaited him down the line. This, of course, was a warning about the eclipse. A year after his fight with Zodd, after leaving the Band of the Falcon, Guts receives the same warning, only this time from Skull Knight. Both SK and Zodd are interested in observing and even playing a role in Guts' fate. However, their reasons for the same differ, and this is where the basis for their rivalry figures in. Skull Knight and Zodd are exceptional warriors fighting for diametrically opposed causes. Zodd is a man with an unquenchable thirst for battle, whose only goal in life is to fight the absolute definition of strength. To that end, he forewent his human shell and reincarnated into an apostle, one of the strongest ones there is at that. Zodd's strength on the battlefield is so unmatched that he's garnered a reputation as being its unofficial god, and he's proven his worth multiple times over against humans and apostles alike. But at the end of the day, he remains an apostle, and has perhaps the most accepting understanding of where he lies in the hierarchy of demonkind. Apostles are all natural slaves to the will of the God Hand, and Zodd is no exception to that rule. But instead of fighting the system like Wild or Ganishka, Zodd works for it, and makes it work for him as well. Once he realized that Griffith was destined to become a God Hand member, Zodd actively contributed to making it happen. He gave Guts an unseen yet crucial assist during the Battle of Doldry, which put Griffith in the position where he needed to be for his downfall. And then he took out Wild to make his journey there smoother. Once Griffith was incarnated into the physical world, Zodd submitted to him after losing a rather surreal battle, and became the God Hand member's right hand of doom. Zodd is front and center in any major temporal junction event that occurs in Berserk, and it makes sense given his nature. Anyone crazy enough to go through what the God Hand puts them through during their rituals has got to be at least a half-decent fighter, and this is where his rivalry with Skull Knight comes into the picture. While Zodd is a servant of the God Hand, Skull Knight is their sworn enemy. He calls himself the foe of the Inhumans for Pete's sake. For as long as he has existed in his current undead form, Skull Knight has been fighting against the tide of inhumanity, and that's how he came across Zodd. Over the course of the millennium that he's been active, Skull Knight has fought against and decimated countless apostles. We've already seen the evidence during the eclipse. The guy cuts through apostles like the blades of a blender, just mincing whatever comes within sword range of him. But somewhere around year 700, he comes across a challenger that just keeps coming back for more. This apostle, built like a chimeric nightmare, was one of the most resilient and battle-driven apostles he'd ever come across. And he knows this because 300 years later, they're still fighting things out. It's in chapter 80 of Berserk that we learn that Skull Knight and Zodd not only know each other, but they've been going at it for the 3 centuries the latter has existed as an apostle. The Immortal One is not surprised to see SK there, because he knows his pattern. At every major temporal junction, the Knight of Skeleton will show up to try and kill his masters. Zodd doesn't fight to protect them though, he fights for the thrill of it. And that's how their rivalry is introduced on screen. Skull vs. Zodd, Round 1, the informal gatekeeper and the one who breaches. Judging by the way he greets him at the eclipse site, Zodd and Skull Knight often find themselves facing each other at the crossroads of causality. Zodd lets out a triumphant snort upon Skull Knight's arrival because he'd been expecting it. He knew that the foe of the Inhumans, their enemy, appeared at every major temporal junction point, and a feast like the eclipse, Skull Knight wasn't about to let that one slip out of his bony fingers. The Wandering Wraith retorts by assuming Zodd Zodd was assigned guard duty, but you'd think he'd know his old rival better than that. Zodd was here for one thing, a fight with a truly strong opponent, and this itself is an indication of his respect for his enemy. Skull Knight thinks to himself that Void would claim this coincidence too was part of Causality's plan, but he has confidence in himself, and he decides to wager himself upon his sword. The scene then shifts to the eclipse itself, where we stay for the next half dozen chapters, but this small exchange reveals so much about their dynamic. Their greeting was akin to two grizzled veterans from opposing sides of a war that had been raging for years beyond count. Their blades had clashed with each other so many times this was now a routine for them. Of course, they've been part of a sort of war, but this was mostly one-sided until Guts came into the picture. Up until then, it had been Skull Knight, shouldering all the burden of cleansing the world of demonic filth. It's good then that he is as skilled and powerful of a swordsman as he is. Like we mentioned earlier in the video, we never see Skull Knight and Zodd actually exchange blows on page. Well, we haven't yet anyways. But we do see the outcome of their exchange, and let us tell you, it leaves little Rickert all kinds of impressed and flabbergasted. Rickert was familiar with Zodd. He had heard of his legends and seen monsters like him kill all of his friends that were part of the reserve unit. What he had never seen was a man who could fight just as well, no, even better than Zodd. We only see a short panel of Rickert recalling the moment Skull Knight leapt at Zodd as part of his appraisal, but considering he left the Immortal One short an arm, you can pretty much guess who won that exchange. Of course, Zodd, being the top-tier apostle he is, just reattaches the severed arm to its stump to heal it. But the fact that Skull Knight outmaneuvered him, broke into the eclipse, killed a bunch of apostles, and escaped with Guts and Casca in tow, all after trying to get in a pot-shot at Void, that just tells you all you need to know about this guy's speed. You can argue that time works differently in an interstice, and that several minutes could have passed inside while Zodd was picking up his arm, but Skull Knight's speed and that butchering alone was worthy of praise. The fact that he returned in a split second is not something that can simply be attributed to dimensional differences, nor is it a thing that will keep Zodd from trying to kill Skull Knight, because as soon as he emerges from the eclipse, Zodd towers over him, waiting for more. The Immortal One doesn't just pounce at him though, he actually engages in dialogue with Skull Knight, like familiar old rivals would. Zodd tells the foe of the Inhumans not to take what just happened as a victory, because their fight wasn't over yet. Skull Knight agrees, but proposes they put things on hold, considering he just saved Guts and Casca because they weren't destined to die yet. Zodd is apprehensive of Skull Knight's request at first, but when he sees who he's talking about, he starts laughing maniacally. See, at the very beginning of Berserk, Zodd had predicted that when Griffith's ambition fell, Guts would be visited by an undying death. That was a reference to the eclipse, of course, but Zodd predicted Guts would die. Instead, he survived, thanks to an assist from Skull Knight. Still, the scars of the battle were more than evident to the Immortal One's eyes, and he relished the chance to meet Guts again in battle once he had survived enough of his daily agonies. He agrees to Skull Knight's temporary truce just for the sake of seeing Guts' progress, and the two old rivals actually kind of cooperate after this point. In the lead up to the incarnation ceremony, Zodd and Guts come across each other on their separate ways to the same destination, the holy city of St. Albion. But instead of fighting, they decide to walk to the city together because both of them know that this will be their final moments in the old world. Skull Knight was headed there because, well, he knew things were out of his control, he wanted to help stop them in some way. Zodd was going there because he knew that at the end of all this, his desired being would be incarnated into the world. Instead of fighting, they just walked the entire way and delayed that fight for another day. A day that would come when their two sides were more clearly defined. But if we had to give a net win to someone on this round, it would be Skull Knight. Dude just sliced up Zodd's arm and casually rescued two people from a hellscape within seconds. An arm that was only previously shown to be damaged by Griffith's razor-sharp saber, a bit of a distraction, and a lot of luck. Or bait. Anyway, point is, round one goes to the foe of the Inhumans, even though it's sort of pointless considering the circumstances surrounding the win. Skull Knight vs. Zodd. Round 2. An old friend's protector and an eradicator of a new threat. The second time Skull Knight and Zodd face each other in a confrontational capacity is during the latter's raid on Flora's spirit mansion tree. Flora was a powerful witch who was Shirkei's teacher as well as an old friend of Skull Knight. Griffith targeted her because the spirit tree that was the axis of her domain was getting in the way of his own world tree's growth. In truth, he just wanted to control the flow of all things astral in the new world, and so he sent his apostle army to take care of it under the leadership of Zodd. The Immortal One decided to send in his fodder forces first, which were once again easily cut down by Skull Knight. In Zodd's defense, he didn't expect to find SK here, and his best guess was that they were all connected. But now that he had them both here at the same time, Zodd was not going to let go of an opportunity for a good fight. He always enjoyed his battles with Skull Knight, and even killed an apostle that tried to step over his authority and go after his target. And after having that intense showdown with Guts on the Hill of Swords, Zodd was buzzing to face him again. Sadly, on this occasion, since he was under orders, he was going to have to settle for his usual, and also Grunbeld called dibs on going after Guts, so there's that too. Not that Zodd was complaining, mind you. Like we mentioned, he relished his battles with Skull Knight, but like his previous encounter with the Wandering Wraith, this one too occurs mostly off-screen. We see Zodd and Skull Knight engage each other, and then we catch up with them mid-battle as Guts puts on the Berserker armor for the first time. When Zodd sees that familiar skull-shaped helmet, he lets out a nostalgic gasp and taunts his rival by asking him if he wanted Guts to take the same path to hell as the Skull Knight did. Skull Knight responds with his trademark silence, and the two call an intuitive truce to see Berserker Guts in action. They hold that truce up until the end of the fight, when Flora magically appears in a sentient wall of flames and helps Guts and co escape the scene. While we didn't see the action itself, it must have been pretty good because before getting the armor, Guts was being taunted by Grunbeld, who kept saying he envies Zodd because he has a worthy opponent. Now, Grunbeld is a bit too full of it when it comes to things like the warrior spirit and such, but his recognition is still worth the weight of his armor in gold. Skull Knight must have been pulling off moves Grunbeld thought he would never see an enemy pull in the face of the Falcon's new beak and talons. Round 2 can be chalked up to a stalemate between Skull Knight and Zodd, but it's a net win for Zodd's team. They managed to accomplish their goal, which was take out the witch. Skull Knight came to Flora in her final hours to help make her path into the afterlife easier, knowing she was doomed from the start. The motivations behind their actions have slightly shifted, but the broader strokes remain the same. What's really interesting about this fight, though, is the fact that it is, as of this moment, the last time we see Zodd and Skull Knight on the same page in the manga. Even before Flora's mansion was turned crispy, Guts had done a 180 from being consumed by his revenge quest to wanting to cure Casca from her current state. After it, that's all he and his group focused on doing, and Skull Knight wasn't directly involved in a lot of this. After the Spirit Tree Mansion attack, Skull Knight only shows up to guide Guts towards Elfhelm, and then at Elfhelm itself. Guts and Zodd briefly cross paths in Vritannis, but they end up allying temporarily to take care of their collective problem, Thundercloud Ganishka. Oh, and Skull Knight does take a brief detour before playing tour guide to try and assassinate Griffith without anyone else's knowledge, but he fails because number 1, causality, and number 2, the Immortal One would have shredded him if he reached him in time anyway. Even when Zodd shows up at Elfhelm to assist Griffith with his kidnapping of Casca, he and Skull Knight never cross paths, which makes you think, are these eternal rivals ducking each other on purpose, or is something else at play here? And will there be an end to this seemingly unending rivalry? Well, that's what we're about to address in the next section. Skull Knight versus Zodd, Round 3. Who will win in the end? And who will die? At this point in the Berserk manga, we're not sure when Skull Knight and Zodd are going to come face to face again, but we're sure that they will because their stories aren't complete. And no, we don't just say that because the manga isn't over yet, we also say that because they're basically one apiece in direct encounters based on the overall results. Skull Knight and Zodd are pretty much guaranteed to have one big blow up of a fight that they actually show us play out on the pages of the manga. But the real question then becomes, who will win that fight in the end? Because no rivalry can be truly eternal, and both Skull Knight and Zodd are involved with forces that could end their lives within an instant. Zodd is already an apostle. At whatever point in his lifetime he dies, his soul will end up in the abyss regardless. We don't know how this soul thing works for Skull Knight because he seems to be attached to his armor, so you can argue that he lives as long as the armor lives or the God Hand die. But what we're trying to say here is that the rivalry has not been set up without reason, and Studio Gaga will be leaving a lot of money on the table by not showing Berserk fans one proper fight to the death between them. So here's how we're imagining it'll happen. Right now, Zodd is with Griffith in Falconia, where they're planning to make an advance towards the eastern hemisphere of the world. We don't know what specifically Griffith is looking for over there, but considering Guts and the crew of the Seahorse are also in the east now, it could just be them. Griffith could be looking to eliminate any potential resistance to his rule before his people even get to hear of his true nature. And starting in the east makes sense considering the fact that many have survived the downfall of the Kushan Empire. Right now, Salat and Daiba are reconstructing Kushan Kushan society as its new leaders, and with Guts and the mages of Elfhelm gathered alongside them, the East becomes a sensible target. So it could be that Zodd and Skull Knight have their final encounter when Griffith's Falcons arrive in Kushan lands with their entire War Demon army's might, but that's not what we think. In order to bring the world back to order, the world spiral tree needs to die. So the final battle of Berserk should technically take place in Falconia. We'll explain why in another video, but Falconia is Griffith's home turf, and he'll be extremely well guarded there. Not to mention, Zodd practically shadows him everywhere, and given that Griffith can pretty much see the future at this point, jumping either of them would be pointless. The only chance Skull Knight has of defeating Zodd in a definitive fashion is if he breaks him away from Griffith, and even then, we're not sure how he's going to do it. Zodd and Skull Knight have been fighting each other on and off over the course of 300 years. If Skull Knight had a way to kill him, you think he'd have done it already. If Zodd is the strongest apostle in existence, and we think he is, then just slicing and dicing him up isn't going to cut it. His hide is thick as stone, in the places it needs to be anyway. No, taking care of the Immortal One is gonna require the big guns. Or rather, the big face-covered sword. One stroke from the Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation is all it would take to send Zodd to the abyss prematurely, and we know that this is possible because those trolls and ogres SK attacked and Clip-Off went there despite not even being fully formed yet. So if Zodd's healing factor proves to be too much of a problem, Skull Knight could just end things by using his Sword of Actuation, but this method has a massive drawback, which is its activation method. The Sword of Actuation can only be created when Skull Knight swallows his sword and coats it with the Behelits inside his body. Doing this mid-battle with an enemy like Zodd is going to be next to impossible. Even with Skull Knight's incredible speed, and with Griffith present, you can forget about this plan even getting off the ground. So if Skull Knight can't separate Griffith from Zodd, how would he defeat him? Well, the answer is plain and simple when you think about it. He teams up with Guts. In order to get to Griffith, Guts will need to go through Zodd first, and what better way to do that than to team up with his eternal infernal ally? If Guts and Skull Knight are able to pull off a sneaky with the Sword of Actuation in the final stages of Berserk, we will flip, because it will correct SK's biggest mistake in the series so far, which is being responsible for basically breaking the world. But it's more likely to be a traditional team-up, just considering how these things tend to play out in manga. Still, we're confident that Skull Knight will defeat Zodd because the Immortal One simply isn't on the Wandering Wraith's level. Sure, Zodd thinks highly of Skull Knight. For a long time, he thought there was no one else in the world that could give him his heart's desire except this wretch, but now that he has it and his priorities have shifted, Zodd is open to new avenues of failure. His dedication to Griffith is borderline fanatical, to the point he threatened to turn his entire army on Guts and Britannis just because the Black Swordsman vaguely suggested he would harm Griffith. That kind of blind faith can make him forget that at the end of the day, he's an inconsequential servant in the eyes of the God Hand. All apostles exist as nothing more than tools for them to play with, and Zodd will end up understanding that bitter truth one day. Hell, he might even end up like Wild himself in what would be an S-tier finishing of a karmic loop, but that remains to be seen. What we've already seen is proof that Skull Knight is a far superior fighter with a much deeper understanding of the medium that he's working in and as than Zodd. We know that Guts' real target is Griffith, so if he could rely on someone else to take out Zodd, he most likely would. And we also know that being warriors at the core of their beings, Zodd and Skull Knight would want nothing more than to settle their scores with a fight. For either of their causes to mean something, the other one needs to die. So the only time we see this rivalry actually coming to an end is when the big one gets closer to its climactic point. And even then, we can only hope that it works out the way we think it will. Marvelous verdict. But as for this video, that's gonna be it. Skull Knight and Zodd's rivalry is honestly one of the most exciting aspects of Berserk, and the fact that Miura got us this invested in it without even showing them fight is a testament to just how much of a genius that man truly was. But that's enough fan service for today. We think Skull Knight kills Zodd if they do take things into deep waters and keep them there, but what do you guys think? Have we missed some element of causality, or is there just some other way you think this has to end? Let us know in the comments down below, but don't forget to like, share, and subscribe first, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, strugglers.